The charity gala at the Rothschild Grand Hotel in Manhattan glittered with a kind of wealth that felt almost violent in its excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of compact cars hung from ceilings painted with gold leaf. Women draped in Valentino and Dio air-kissed each other with the precision of trained assassins. Men in Tom Ford tuxedos discussed hedge funds and Senate races over glasses of champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. The air smelled of imported roses, expensive cologne, and the particular brand of confidence that comes from never having to check a price tag. At the edge of this glittering universe, near the service entrance where the waitstaff emerged with trays of caviar and foie gras, stood an old man who did not belong. His name was Thomas Webb, and everything about him screamed poverty with a kind of volume that made the wealthy uncomfortable. His suit, if it could be called that, was a thrift store resurrection, brown polyester that had been out of style for 3 decades. The fabric hung loose on his thin frame, sleeves slightly too short, revealing wrists that looked like they'd been carved from driftwood. His shoes were held together with duct tape at the soles. His white hair, though clean, had been cut by his own unsteady hand in a bathroom mirror. His face was deeply lined, each wrinkle a topographical map of hardship, loss, and years spent sleeping in places where sleep never really came. But his eyes were clear, determined, fixed on something across the room, with a kind of focus that comes from carrying a promise too heavy to put down. He clutched a worn leather satchel against his chest like it contained the only thing in the world that mattered. Because it did. The grand piano sat on a raised platform at the center of the ballroom, a 9-foot Steinway Model D worth more than a house in most American cities. Its black lacquer surface reflected the chandelier light like a dark mirror. No one had touched it yet. The entertainment for the evening, a renowned classical pianist from Vienna, wasn't scheduled to perform for another hour. The instrument sat waiting, patient, perfect. Thomas had been planning this moment for 3 months. Ever since he'd seen the announcement for the gala in a newspaper someone had left on a subway bench. The Children's Hospital Foundation benefit. $5,000 a plate. The kind of event where Manhattan's elite gathered to feel generous while writing checks that would barely dent their quarterly investment returns. He'd walked 17 blocks to get here. His knees ached. His back screamed. The November cold had settled into his bones during the 6 hours he'd waited outside, watching arrivals, waiting for the moment when security would be distracted enough for him to slip through a service entrance behind a catering truck. Now he was inside. And now came the hard part. He approached the platform slowly, each step measured, trying not to draw attention. Around him, conversations buzzed with the particular rhythm of the wealthy at leisure. Stock prices. Vacation homes in Aspen. Children at Yale and Stanford. Complaints about the new tax proposals that felt obscene when spoken in rooms like this. No one looked at him. Or rather, they looked through him. The way people look through homeless men on subway platforms, their eyes sliding away before full recognition could occur and force some uncomfortable reckoning with inequality. He reached the platform, climbed the 3 steps. His hand trembled as he extended it toward the piano bench. "Excuse me." The voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. Cold. Sharp. Accustomed to being obeyed. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Thomas turned. The man approaching was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Thomas had earned in the last 5 years. His face was handsome in the way of men who'd never missed a meal, never worried about rent, never felt the particular terror of medical bills they couldn't pay. His hair was silver at the temples, perfectly styled. His watch was a Patek Philippe, the kind that gets passed down through generations of inherited wealth. Everything about him radiated power, control, and the absolute certainty that the world would bend to accommodate his preferences. His name was Richard Blackwell, investment banker, board member of half a dozen corporations, net worth in the 9 figures. He'd donated $50,000 to be here tonight, mostly for the networking opportunities and the tax write-off. Thomas's voice came out rough, unused to speaking in rooms like this. "I was hoping I might play. Just one song. It's full. Play." Blackwell's laugh was sharp, meant to cut. Heads turned. Conversations paused. An audience was gathering, drawn by the promise of spectacle. "You want to play the Steinway? At a charity gala? Looking like He gestured at Thomas's appearance with barely concealed disgust. Like you just crawled out of a dumpster. Heat flooded Thomas's face. Shame, that old companion, wrapped around his throat. But underneath it, something else. Something that had kept him alive through winters and shelters, through hunger, through the grief that never really faded. Purpose. Please, he said quietly. It's important. I just need 5 minutes. I can. Security. Blackwell's voice boomed across the ballroom. We have a vagrant who's wandered in from the street. Someone want to explain how our $5,000 plate event has been compromised by. He looked Thomas up and down. By this. 2 security guards started toward the platform. The crowd had fully formed now, a semicircle of evening gowns and tuxedos, faces arranged in expressions ranging from amusement to disgust to carefully maintained neutrality. This was entertainment. A break in the monotony of another charity gala. Someone was about to be humiliated, and they'd paid good money for distraction. Where are you watching this from? Thomas thought distantly, wondering if there was anyone out there who understood what it felt like to carry something precious through a world that looked at you and saw nothing worth seeing. Drop a comment and let me know. Wait. A woman's voice, soft but clear, cut through the moment. She stepped forward from the crowd, younger than most here, maybe 40, wearing a simple black dress that probably cost more than Thomas's entire existence. Her face held something the others didn't. Curiosity. Maybe kindness. Let him play. What's the harm? If is terrible, we'll have a story. If is good. She shrugged. We'll have heard something beautiful. Blackwell stared at her like she'd suggested they invite rats to dinner. Jennifer, this is absurd. The man is clearly mentally ill or intoxicated or both. He probably can't even read music, let alone. I can read music, Thomas said quietly. His hand went to the satchel. My mother taught me. She was a concert pianist. Before. The word hung in the air, heavy with everything he couldn't explain. Before the cancer. Before the medical bills that devoured their savings. Before she'd kept teaching even when her hands shook from chemotherapy, insisting he practice. Before she died in a county hospital with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors, holding his hand, making him promise. Promise me you'll never stop playing. Promise me you'll find a way back to the music. Blackwell's eyes gleamed with something cruel. An idea forming. You know what? Fine. Let's make this interesting. He raised his voice so the whole crowd could hear. You want to play? Here's the deal. You play something, anything, and if you're actually good, if you can prove you're not just some delusional homeless man who wandered in here with delusions of grandeur, I'll personally write a check for $50,000 to the charity tonight. Double my original donation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. $50,000. A serious sum, even here. But, Blackwell continued, his smile widening, when you fail, and you will fail, you leave immediately. No arguments. No second chances. Security escorts you out, and we all get back to our evening without further disruption from the street people who apparently think they can just wander into private events whenever they feel like it. The crowd's energy shifted. This was theater now. A spectacle. The old man in the thrift store suit versus the Steinway. David and Goliath, if David was 70 years old, looked half-starved, and smelled faintly of the streets. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. His hands trembled. Not from fear, though there was that, but from something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He thought of his mother. The way her fingers had moved across keys even when the cancer had eaten away her strength. The way she'd made music that could silence rooms, bring audiences to tears, transform air and time into something transcendent. She'd played for presidents. Carnegie Hall. The Kennedy Center. Before poverty and illness had stolen everything. And she taught him. Every day after school, even when she was too weak to stand, she'd made him practice. Scales. Arpeggios. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Beethoven. She'd poured everything she knew into him, a desperate attempt to pass something forward before death took her. He'd kept playing after she died. Even when he lost their apartment. Even when he lost everything. He'd find pianos in churches, community centers, anywhere that would let him touch keys for a few stolen moments. He'd kept the promise. And now, in this satchel pressed against his chest, he carried the reason he'd come. "Okay," Thomas said. His voice was steadier now. "I'll play." Blackwell's smile was triumphant. He'd already won, and he knew it. This would be the story he told at dinner parties for months. The time some crazy old homeless guy tried to play Steinway at the Rothschild benefit and made a complete fool of himself. The crowd pressed closer. Thomas set his satchel carefully beside the piano bench. He sat down, feeling the smooth leather of the bench, the perfect height, the kind of instrument he hadn't touched in 15 years. His hands hovered over the keys. White and black, perfectly maintained, holding within them every piece of music ever written, waiting. He took a breath. Thought of his mother. Her hands on his, teaching him finger positions when he was 6 years old. The way she'd played Claire de Lune at his father's funeral. The last thing she'd said to him before the morphine took her completely. "Music is the only thing they can't take from us." He began to play. The first notes fell into the ballroom like stones into still water, sending ripples through the crystalline silence. Thomas's hands moved across the keys with a certainty that made Blackwell's smile falter. Not the hesitant fumbling of an amateur. Not even the practiced competence of someone who'd taken lessons. Something else entirely. Something that made people stop mid-conversation. Champagne glasses frozen halfway to lips, because the sound that emerged from the Steinway was arresting in a way that demanded attention. He was playing Rachmaninoff. Piano Concerto No. 2. The opening movement, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Without the orchestra, of course, just the piano part, but played with the kind of mathematical precision and emotional depth that suggested this wasn't recreation. This was muscle memory, so deep it lived in his bones. His fingers flew across the keys, arpeggios cascading like water, chords struck with perfect timing, the melody emerging through technical complexity like a thread of gold through dark fabric. The thrift store suit, the duct tape shoes, the face carved by poverty and loss, all of it faded. What remained was the music, and the man creating it, and the sudden, uncomfortable realization settling over the crowd that they had miscalculated badly. Blackwell's face had gone pale. He stood frozen, mouth slightly open, watching those gnarled hands produce sound that shouldn't have been possible from someone who looked like that, who came from nowhere, who wore poverty like a second skin. The technical difficulty was undeniable. Rachmaninoff had enormous hands, and he'd written music that assumed the same reach, requiring stretches and leaps that most pianists struggled to execute cleanly. Thomas executed them flawlessly, his thin fingers spanning intervals that should have been impossible, landing on exactly the right keys with exactly the right pressure, creating dynamics that ranged from whisper-soft to thunderous. But technical skill alone wouldn't have created the silence that had fallen over the ballroom. What made people stare? What made the woman who defended him press her hand to her mouth in surprise? What made even the catering staff stop moving to listen? Was the emotion. Thomas played like a man possessed by memory. Every note carried weight. The opening's dark, brooding meditation on loss. The way the melody climbed desperately toward hope before falling back into darkness. The passages that sounded like questions asked into a void that gave no answers. He played grief and beauty and the terrible human insistence on creating something transcendent even in the midst of suffering. He played his mother. The way she'd looked in her prime, young and vital, commanding stages across America and Europe. The way she'd looked later, hands shaking from medication, still insisting on teaching him, still making him understand that music was the language they spoke when English failed. The hospital room. The funeral he'd attended alone. The years after, when poverty had stripped away everything except the memories and the promise. 50 people stood transfixed, experiencing something they hadn't expected from their $5,000 evening. Genuine art, performed by someone with nothing to gain except the chance to keep a promise. Near the back of the crowd, an older man in an immaculate tuxedo frowned in concentration. His name was Dr. Harold Chen, and he'd spent 40 years as the director of the Manhattan Conservatory of Music before retiring. He'd heard thousands of pianists, from students to professionals to genuine virtuosos. His ear was trained to detect not just technical skill, but the ineffable quality that separated good musicians from great ones. What he was hearing now made no sense. The technique was conservatory level, possibly beyond. The interpretation was sophisticated, mature, showing deep understanding of the piece's structure and emotional arc. The physical execution suggested thousands of hours of practice, the kind of dedication that started in childhood and never stopped. But the man playing looked like he'd been sleeping in subway stations. Dr. Chen moved closer, weaving through the crowd until he stood near the platform, watching Thomas's hands with the intense focus of someone analyzing a puzzle that shouldn't exist. The piece was building toward its climax, the moment where the piano part erupts in a cascade of notes that sound like something breaking open, releasing everything held inside. Thomas leaned into it, his whole body engaged now, swaying slightly with the music's momentum, his face transformed by concentration and something else. Joy? Maybe. Or relief. The look of someone who'd been holding their breath for years and finally exhaled. The final crescendo shook the air. Chords struck with perfect force, resonating through the ballroom's acoustic space. Then the descent, the winding down, the melody finding its way back to the opening's darkness but transformed now by everything that had come between. Acceptance, maybe. Or understanding that beauty and sorrow weren't opposites but twins. The last notes faded into silence, so complete it felt physical. Thomas lifted his hands from the keys slowly, as if breaking contact hurt. He sat very still, breathing hard, his eyes closed. For 5 seconds, no one moved. Then Dr. Chen began to clap. Slow, measured, the kind of applause that isn't just appreciation but acknowledgement. Recognition from someone who knows exactly what they've heard and what it means. Others joined. Tentatively at first, then building, until the ballroom filled with applause that sounded different from the polite appreciation these people usually offered. This was surprised. Genuine. The woman who defended Thomas was crying openly. Blackwell stood motionless, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to track. Shock, disbelief, confusion. And underneath it all, the dawning horror of someone who'd made a catastrophic miscalculation in public. Dr. Chen approached the platform. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the applause. "I'm Harold Chen. I ran the Manhattan Conservatory for 40 years. I need to know, where did you train?" Thomas opened his eyes. They were wet. "My mother taught me. Catherine Webb. She played with the New York Philharmonic in the 70s and 80s. Before." Dr. Chen's face changed completely. "Catherine Webb? Kathy Webb." His voice cracked. "My God. I heard her play Chopin at Carnegie in 1982. It was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever witnessed. She was." He stopped, emotion choking off the words. "What happened to her?" "Cancer," Thomas said simply. "We lost everything paying for treatment. She kept teaching me until the end. Made me promise I'd never stop playing." The ballroom's energy shifted again. The story was clarifying, taking shape. This wasn't just some random vagrant who happened to play piano. This was tragedy with roots, history, context. This was someone who'd fallen from a great height. Blackwell found his voice. That doesn't prove anything. So he learned from his mother. That doesn't mean. That was Rachmaninoff's second, Dr. Chen said coldly, turning to face him. One of the most technically demanding pieces in the repertoire. He played it from memory, without sheet music, with interpretation that suggests not just training but genuine artistry. Most professional pianists would struggle with that piece. He performed it flawlessly. He paused, his eyes hard. "You owe this man $50,000. And an apology." Blackwell's jaw worked silently. Around him, faces that had been friendly 30 minutes ago now looked at him differently. Judgment, sharp and immediate, was being passed. "I think," Jennifer said quietly from the crowd, "that we'd all like to hear the story. If you're willing to share it, Mr. Webb. How you got from Catherine Webb's son to..." She gestured gently at his appearance, not cruelty but honest confusion. Thomas reached for his satchel with trembling hands. "I can explain," he said. "But first, I need to show you why I came." Thomas opened the satchel with the careful reverence of someone handling something sacred. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag from a grocery store, was a photograph. He lifted it out, the protective plastic crinkling, and held it up for the crowd to see. The photo was old, the colors slightly faded, but the image was clear. A young woman sat at a grand piano, her hands poised above the keys, mid-performance. She wore an elegant black gown, her dark hair swept up, her face caught in an expression of absolute concentration and joy. Behind her, slightly out of focus, stood a full orchestra. The photo had been taken at Carnegie Hall, judging by the distinctive architecture visible in the background. Catherine Webb in her prime. Beautiful. Talented. Alive. Beside her in the photo, printed on the program visible on the piano's music stand, were the words Benefit Concert for Children's Hospital Foundation. The same charity hosting tonight's gala. My mother, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion, played at Carnegie Hall 43 years ago to raise money for the Children's Hospital. It was one of her proudest performances. She talked about it constantly when I was growing up. How the music that night had raised enough money to build a new pediatric wing. How she'd felt like her talent had purpose beyond just entertainment. He set the photo carefully on top of the piano. Beside it, he placed another document from the satchel. A program from that concert, yellowed with age, preserved in a plastic sleeve. Then another photo, this one showing Catherine Webb standing with a group of children in hospital gowns, all of them smiling, gathered around a piano in what looked like a hospital recreation room. She volunteered there, Thomas continued. Every month for 20 years, she went to Children's Hospital and played for the kids. Not for money, just because she believed music could heal things medicine couldn't touch. Dr. Chen moved closer to examine the photos. His hand shook slightly as he picked up the concert program. I remember this night, he whispered. June 1981. She played Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. The standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. Thomas nodded. She kept every news clipping, every letter from parents thanking her, every drawing kids made for her. When she got sick, when we lost everything, when we ended up in that county hospital with no insurance and bills that buried us, she made me promise something. His voice broke. He had to stop, breathe, force the words out. She made me promise that if I ever got the chance, I'd play for Children's Hospital one more time. Finish what she started. Honor the place that meant so much to her. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. I've been homeless for 12 years, Thomas said. After she died, I couldn't keep our apartment. Couldn't hold a job. The grief was too heavy, and I was too old, too broken. I've slept in shelters, under bridges, in subway stations. But I never stopped playing. Whenever I found a piano, in a church basement or a community center, I'd play. I'd practice. I'd keep her music alive. He reached into the satchel one more time and pulled out a small, worn envelope. 3 months ago, I was sleeping near the public library, and I found a newspaper someone had thrown away. There was an announcement about tonight's gala. Same charity, same mission. And I thought. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in shaky handwriting on lined paper. I thought maybe this was my chance to keep my promise. He unfolded the letter and held it up. The crowd leaned in to read the words written in careful, precise script. Asterisk to whoever finds this. My son Thomas is the finest pianist I ever taught. When I'm gone, the music doesn't die with me. It lives in him. Please, if you can, give him a chance to play. Let the world hear what I heard every day, proof that beauty can survive anything. Asterisk. It was signed, Catherine Webb, October 2009. 2 months before she died. Jennifer was crying openly now. Several other people in the crowd had tears streaming down their faces. Even the security guards stood frozen, their earlier purpose forgotten. Dr. Chen took the letter with shaking hands, examining the signature. This is authentic, he said, his voice thick. I knew her handwriting. I have letters she wrote me about scholarship students. He looked up at Thomas. She was right about you. That performance was extraordinary. Blackwell hadn't moved. His face had gone gray, all the earlier confidence and cruelty drained away, replaced by something that looked like dawning horror. He was doing calculations, Thomas could see. Reputational calculations. The kind that rich men do when they realize they've made a mistake in public that can't be unmade. I. Blackwell started, then stopped. His voice came out strangled. I didn't know. No, Thomas said quietly. You didn't ask. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Dr. Chen turned to Blackwell, and his voice was ice. You owe this man $50,000. You made a bet, in front of witnesses. He's proven beyond any doubt that he's not just competent but genuinely skilled. Pay him. Blackwell's mouth opened and closed. I'll write a check. Right now. To the charity, as I said. No. Dr. Chen's voice cut like a blade. You'll write 2 checks. $50,000 to Children's Hospital Foundation, as promised. And another $50,000 to Mr. Webb personally, as compensation for the humiliation you subjected him to. He paused, then added with quiet fury, you tried to use this man's poverty as entertainment. You mocked him, called him mentally ill, suggested he was delusional, all because he didn't look like he belonged in your world. Well, he belonged here more than any of us. His mother helped build this charity. His talent exceeds anything you'll ever achieve. And you tried to have him thrown out like garbage. The crowd murmured agreement. Faces that had been merely interested now looked at Blackwell with open disgust. Furthermore, Dr. Chen continued, I'll be recommending to the Foundation's board that your membership is suspended pending review. We don't need donors who treat people this way. Blackwell's face flushed red. You can't. I can. I'm founding board member. And unless you want this story in every newspaper in New York by morning, investment banker humiliates homeless pianist at charity event, I suggest you write those checks immediately and apologize. Sincerely. The threat was clear. Blackwell was being given one chance to salvage something from this disaster. His hands shook as he pulled out his checkbook. While he wrote, Jennifer approached Thomas. Mr. Webb, she said softly, my name is Jennifer Morrison. I run a foundation that provides housing and support services for people experiencing homelessness. I'd like to help you. No strings attached. Just, let me help. Thomas looked at her, this stranger offering kindness, and something in his chest cracked open. I just wanted to keep my promise, he whispered. You did, she said, taking his hand. Your mother would be so proud. Blackwell finished writing the checks with jerky, mechanical movements. He handed them to Dr. Chen, who examined them carefully before passing one to Thomas and one to a foundation representative who'd appeared from somewhere in the crowd. $100,000 total. Enough to change everything. Now apologize, Dr. Chen said quietly. Blackwell turned to Thomas. His face was ashen, humiliated, but something else flickered in his eyes. Maybe the beginning of genuine remorse. Maybe just fear of public relations disaster. I'm sorry, he said, the words coming out stiff and formal. I judged you based on appearance. It was wrong. You're clearly an exceptional musician. And I was cruel. I apologize. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Thomas took the check with numb fingers. $100,000, made out to him personally. More money than he'd seen in 15 years. Enough for an apartment, clothes, food, maybe even a piano of his own. Stories like these spread fast in the age of social media, captured on phones and shared across platforms where people hungry for justice and transformation could watch dignity restored in real time. The video that night would be uploaded by a dozen different people, viewed millions of times, commented on by viewers from every state and background who understood that worth couldn't be measured by appearance. They would subscribe to see more moments of humanity recognized, would share the story with friends, would check descriptions for similar tales of hidden value revealed and justice delivered. Because people needed to believe the world still contained moments like this, where talent overcame prejudice, where promises were kept, where the invisible became impossible to ignore. Thomas looked at the piano, at the photo of his mother, at the crowd of wealthy strangers who, for one night, had seen him clearly. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for letting me play. 6 months later, Thomas Webb stood in the lobby of a modest apartment building in Queens, holding a key in his hand that still felt impossibly foreign. His apartment. Not a shelter bed. Not a corner in a subway station. An actual apartment with a door that locked, heat that worked, and windows that looked out over a tree-lined street where children played. The transformation hadn't been instant. Money solved some problems but not others. Jennifer Morrison had connected him with social workers, therapists, and job counselors who helped him navigate systems he'd been locked out of for over a decade. The process of getting identification, opening a bank account, establishing credit, all the invisible infrastructure of normal life, had taken months of paperwork and patience. But he'd persisted. Just like he'd persisted through 12 years of homelessness, practicing on borrowed pianos, keeping his mother's promise alive. The apartment was small, a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom that was entirely his, but it felt like a palace. He'd furnished it simply, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and in the corner by the window, the thing that had consumed most of the $100,000, a piano. Not a Steinway, he couldn't afford that, and didn't need it, but a quality upright, professionally tuned, with keys that responded to his touch like old friends. He played it every morning and every evening, filling the apartment with Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, and his mother's favorite pieces. His neighbors never complained. Sometimes he'd see them standing in the hallway outside his door, listening. Blackwell's story had taken a different turn. The video of that night had gone viral, just as Dr. Chen had predicted. Millions of views. News coverage. Think pieces about wealth, privilege, and the invisibility of poverty. Blackwell's firm had quietly asked him to resign, citing reputation concerns and liability issues. His social standing in Manhattan's elite circles had evaporated overnight. But something unexpected had happened 3 months after the gala. Blackwell had shown up at Thomas's apartment. Sober, humble, genuinely broken. "I've been in therapy," he'd said, standing in the doorway like a supplicant. "Trying to understand how I became someone who could treat another human being that way. My therapist suggested I make amends. Real amends. Not just an apology but action." Thomas had let him in, wary but curious. Blackwell had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. He'd been volunteering at homeless shelters, he explained. Donating not just money but time. Learning names. Hearing stories. Confronting his own assumptions about poverty, addiction, and mental illness. "I'll never be able to undo what I did to you," Blackwell had said quietly. "But I'm trying to become someone different. Someone my children won't be ashamed of." It wasn't friendship. Thomas wasn't sure it ever would be. But it was something. A recognition that people could change if they chose to do the hard, uncomfortable work of looking at themselves honestly. Dr. Chen had become a regular presence in Thomas's life. The old professor had arranged for Thomas to give a concert at the conservatory, a formal performance with full publicity, honoring Catherine Webb's legacy. The event had sold out in days. Thomas had played his mother's favorite pieces, and at the end, he'd dedicated the performance to everyone who'd ever felt invisible, who'd ever been judged by appearance rather than substance. The concert had raised another $100,000 for Children's Hospital. But the most meaningful change had been quieter, more personal. Jennifer Morrison's foundation had hired Thomas as a music therapist. He visited shelters across the city, teaching piano to anyone who wanted to learn. His students were people like him, forgotten, dismissed, carrying trauma and loss. But in the music, they found the same thing he'd found, a language for expressing things that couldn't be said in words. Hope, grief, the stubborn insistence on beauty in the midst of suffering. One student in particular had reminded Thomas of himself. A teenage girl named Elena, kicked out by her family at 16, living in the shelter system, who'd sat down at the donated keyboard in the recreation room and played with natural talent that made Thomas's breath catch. He'd worked with her every week for 4 months. Taught her technique, theory, the pieces his mother had taught him. Watched her confidence grow as her playing improved. When she'd been accepted to a summer music program with a full scholarship, application submitted with Thomas's recommendation, she'd cried in his arms, disbelieving that anyone saw value in her. "You're going to do amazing things," he told her. "Your talent is a gift. Use it." Now, standing in his apartment with the key in his hand, Thomas thought about chains of generosity. His mother teaching him teaching Elena. Elena who would teach others. Music passing forward through generations, transforming lives in ways that couldn't be quantified or measured but were real nonetheless. The Children's Hospital had invited him to become their artist in residence. Twice a month, he played for the kids, the same work his mother had done 40 years ago. He'd sit in recreation rooms and patient wards, playing whatever they requested. Disney songs, pop music, classical pieces. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way their faces changed when the music started. The way pain receded, even temporarily. The way parents cried quiet tears of gratitude for something beautiful in the midst of their terror. The foundation had used his story to launch a new initiative, identifying and supporting talented individuals experiencing homelessness. Music programs, art supplies, instruments donated, lessons provided. 50 people in the first 6 months had been connected with resources, training, opportunities they'd never imagined possible. Systemic change was slow, Thomas had learned. Frustrating. One person couldn't fix poverty, couldn't eliminate inequality, couldn't solve the complex web of policies and circumstances that left people sleeping on streets in one of the richest cities on earth. But he could play piano, could teach, could show up, could refuse to let his mother's belief in beauty and dignity die with her. One evening, he received a letter. The handwriting was shaky but careful, written on notebook paper. It was from a man who'd seen the viral video in a library computer lab, who'd been homeless for 8 years, who'd given up on everything. "Your story reminded me I used to play guitar," the letter said. "Before I lost everything. I found an old guitar at a pawn shop. Started playing again. It's been 3 weeks, and I feel like I'm remembering who I used to be. Thank you for showing me it's not too late." Thomas pinned the letter to his wall. Beside it, he hung the photograph of his mother at Carnegie Hall. Every morning when he woke, he'd look at her face, young, vibrant, full of purpose, and remember the promise. He'd kept it, against every odd, through every hardship. And now, he'd made a new promise. To keep playing, to keep teaching, to honor not just his mother's memory, but everyone who'd ever felt invisible, dismissed, judged unworthy by people who'd never bothered to look closely enough to see the human being underneath. The piano in the corner waited. Thomas sat down, his hands finding their position on the keys with the muscle memory of 50 years. He began to play Claire de Lune, the piece his mother had played at his father's funeral, the piece that always made him cry. But today, the tears were different. Not just grief anymore, gratitude, purpose. The complicated, beautiful emotion of someone who'd survived the unsurvivable and found meaning in the wreckage. Music filled the small apartment, spilled into the hallway, floated out the window into the Queen's evening, where people walking past might pause, just for a moment, and hear something that reminded them the world still held beauty worth stopping for. 1 year after the gala, Thomas returned to the Rothschild Grand Hotel. This time, he entered through the front door. This time, he wore a suit that fit, not expensive, but clean, pressed, respectable. This time, when the staff saw him, they smiled in recognition. The Children's Hospital Foundation was hosting another benefit. The invitation had come personally from Dr. Chen, who'd remained on the board specifically to ensure the foundation's mission stayed true to its original purpose, helping children and honoring those who'd dedicated their lives to that work. Thomas's invitation said, "Honorary guest and performer." The ballroom looked the same, crystal chandeliers, gold leaf, Manhattan's elite gathering to write checks and feel generous. But Thomas saw it differently now. Not as a world he didn't belong to, but as a room full of complicated people, some genuinely kind, some performing kindness, most somewhere in between. Human, in all the messy, contradictory ways humans were. He found Dr. Chen near the stage, where the same Steinway Model D sat waiting. The old professor's face lit up when he saw Thomas. "Kathy would be so proud," Dr. Chen said, embracing him. "Not just of your playing, though that's extraordinary, but of what you've done with your second chance. The kids you're teaching, the lives you're changing." Thomas thought about Elena, who was attending a prestigious music camp in Vermont this summer, her tuition covered by a scholarship fund Jennifer Morrison had established. About Marcus, a 40-year-old veteran he'd been teaching for 6 months, who'd just gotten hired as a music teacher at a public school. About the 12 other students currently in his program, all of them finding their way back to music and through music back to themselves. "I'm just passing forward what she gave me," Thomas said. The evening's program began. Speeches about the Foundation's work. Statistics about lives saved, treatments funded, families supported. A video showing the new pediatric wing, bright, cheerful, with a music room where Thomas now played every other Tuesday. Then Dr. Chen took the microphone. "Tonight, we have a very special performance," he said. "Many of you know the story of Thomas Webb, how he came to us a year ago, how his extraordinary talent almost went unrecognized, how close we came to throwing out someone who turned out to be one of the most gifted musicians I've encountered in 40 years of teaching." The room was silent, attentive. Many faces Thomas recognized from that first night. Jennifer Morrison, who'd become a friend. The security guards who'd almost escorted him out, who now nodded at him with respect. Even Blackwell was there, sitting near the back, his face carefully neutral. "But what you might not know," Dr. Chen continued, "is that Thomas has spent this past year building something extraordinary. A program that provides music education and instruments to people experiencing homelessness. His teaching piano to children in shelters. His connecting talented individuals with resources they'd never otherwise access. His creating pathways for people to rediscover dignity through art." Applause rippled through the room. Thomas felt his face flush. "The Foundation is proud to announce," Dr. Chen said, his voice thick with emotion, "that we're partnering with Thomas to expand this program citywide. We're establishing the Catherine Webb Memorial Music Initiative, a fully funded program that will provide instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities to anyone who wants to learn, regardless of housing status or ability to pay." The applause grew louder. Thomas saw people standing, and his vision blurred with tears. Dr. Chen gestured to the stage. "Thomas will now play for us. But first, he's asked to introduce someone special." Thomas walked to the microphone on shaking legs. He looked out over the crowd of wealthy, powerful people, and thought about all the invisible people they'd passed on the way here. The homeless man outside the subway station. The woman pushing a shopping cart full of her possessions. The teenager sleeping in a doorway. All the people who move through the world unseen, their worth unrecognized, their potential unknown. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite his emotion. "A year ago, I came here with nothing but a promise and a photograph. Tonight, I want to introduce you to someone who reminds me why that promise mattered." Elena walked onto the stage. 17 now, wearing a simple dress provided by the Foundation, her hair pulled back, her face showing the particular combination of terror and excitement that came with performing for the first time in front of an audience like this. She'd been homeless for 2 years. Now she lived in a transitional housing program Jennifer ran, attending high school, taking college preparatory classes, and practicing piano 3 hours a day. She sat at the Steinway, her hands trembling slightly as they found the keys. Thomas stood beside her. "This is Elena," he said to the crowd. 2 years ago, she was sleeping in subway stations. Today, she's one of the most talented young pianists I've ever taught. She's been accepted to Humiliated with a full scholarship, starting next fall." Gasps from the audience. Elena's hands steadied. "She's going to play a piece my mother taught me when I was her age," Thomas continued. "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. I've taught her everything I learned from Catherine Webb, not just the notes, but what they mean. How music can transform suffering into beauty. How art reminds us of our shared humanity." He stepped back. Elena took a breath and began to play. The music that emerged from the Steinway was achingly beautiful. She played with the technical precision Thomas had drilled into her, but also with something uniquely her own, a raw emotional honesty that came from knowing what it meant to be invisible, to be discarded, to fight your way back to being seen. The nocturne flowed through the ballroom, its gentle melody speaking of night and solitude and the quiet persistence of hope. Elena's face was transformed, just as Thomas's had been a year ago. She was no longer a homeless teenager. She was an artist, channeling something transcendent through her fingers and the keys. When she finished, the silence lasted 5 full seconds before the applause erupted. Standing ovation. People crying openly. Elena stood and bowed, her face radiant with disbelief and joy. Thomas embraced her. "You're going to change the world," he whispered. "Just like my mother did. Just like you already are." The rest of the evening blurred. Thomas played Rachmaninoff's Second Again, the piece that had started everything. Donations poured in for the Catherine Webb Memorial Initiative. By the end of the night, they'd raised $500,000. Enough to fund 50 scholarships. Enough to buy 100 instruments. Enough to hire teachers and establish programs in shelters across all 5 boroughs. Blackwell approached as the crowd began to disperse. He looked different, older, more worn, but somehow more real. The polished arrogance had been replaced by something humbler. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for not destroying me, for giving me a chance to become someone better." Thomas studied him. The man who'd tried to humiliate him, who'd called him delusional, who'd almost had him thrown out. The man who'd spent the past year trying to atone. "We all deserve second chances," Thomas said. "That's what my mother believed. That's what I believe." Blackwell nodded, his eyes wet. "I've been volunteering with Elena's program. Doing administrative work. It's not much, but—" "It's everything," Thomas interrupted. "Every bit helps. Every person who chooses to see others clearly instead of through prejudice, that's how things change." Later, after everyone had left, Thomas stood alone on the stage with the Steinway. He pulled out the photograph of his mother, now professionally framed, which would hang in the Foundation's new music center opening next month. He touched the piano keys gently, not playing, just feeling the smooth surface under his calloused fingers. "I kept the promise, Mom," he whispered. "The music didn't die. It's multiplying. It's spreading. Elena's playing now. Marcus is teaching. Dozens of others are finding their way back to beauty." He thought about the long journey, the years of homelessness, the grief, the cold nights and hungry days, the shame of being invisible, and then the impossible moment when someone had finally let him play and everything had changed. But it hadn't really changed in that moment, he realized. It had been changing all along. Every time he'd found a piano and practiced despite having nowhere to sleep. Every time he'd chosen dignity over despair. Every time he'd kept the promise, even when it seemed pointless. The transformation hadn't happened on a stage in front of wealthy benefactors. It had happened in 10,000 small moments of refusing to let poverty define his worth, of insisting that he was more than his circumstances, of believing that the music mattered, that beauty mattered, that promises made to dying mothers mattered. Now he was passing that forward, teaching others that their worth wasn't determined by where they slept or what they wore or how society labeled them, that everyone carried something valuable inside, talent, knowledge, kindness, resilience, waiting to be recognized. The program would continue growing. More students, more instruments, more moments like Elena's tonight, when someone invisible suddenly became impossible to ignore. Thomas played one final piece. Claire de Lune, his mother's favorite. He played it for her memory, for Elena's future, for everyone who'd ever felt unseen, for the complicated, heartbreaking, beautiful work of creating spaces where human dignity was recognized and honored. The music filled the empty ballroom, carrying with it everything he'd learned, that worth couldn't be measured by appearance or status, that dignity was owed to every person, not earned through performance, that kindness cost nothing, but its absence cost everything, that change was possible when people chose to see each other clearly, past the surfaces and assumptions, to the human beings underneath. When the last note faded, Thomas stood. He turned off the stage lights, walked through the now empty hotel, stepped out into the New York night, where the city hummed with millions of invisible people, all of them carrying their own hidden worth, their own untold stories, their own promises they were trying to keep. Tomorrow, he'd return to teaching, to playing for children in hospitals, to building the program that would reach more people, create more opportunities, transform more lives. Tonight, he walked home to his small apartment in Queens, where his piano waited, where he'd play one more piece before sleep, just for himself and his mother's memory. The old man in the thrift store suit was gone, but what he'd carried, the music, the promise, the belief that beauty could survive anything, that remained, growing, spreading, creating ripples that would reach further than he'd ever know, touching lives he'd never meet, proving that worth existed everywhere, waiting only for someone willing to look closely enough to see it.